We all know that Bilbo's sword's sting was magical, but how magical? And who was its original owner? Let's take a look. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to Deep Geek. On this channel we do breakdowns and lore explainers about Tolkien's world, as well as A Song of Ice and Fire, The Witcher and more. Welcome. Bilbo found Sting quite early on in The Hobbit. It was part of the troll horde the party helped themselves to when they were actually not that far outside the Shire. As well as gold and other treasures, there were two particularly impressive swords with fine scabbards and jewelled hilts. Glamdring, which Gandalf took, and Orcrist, which Thorin took. Bilbo found Sting, though it did not have a name at the time, in the same hoard, though it was evidently much less impressive, a long knife for humans or elves, and little more than a pocket knife for the trolls. It had a simple leather sheath. For a hobbit, it was, of course, perfect short sword length, and Bilbo knew by then how dangerous this adventure might get, so he took it. The mystery of those blades was evident from the start. Where did they come from? Why were they there? Why, in fact, were the trolls even there, that far west? Gandalf looks at the swords curiously, we're told, noting that they weren't made by trolls or humans from those parts or times. He seems not to be able to read the runes on them, though Tolkien did go back and tweak that detail later, clarifying that they were just too dirty for the runes to be made out properly. Luckily, they were soon to stop at Rivendell, where the blades were cleaned up and shown to Elrond. This is what he told them. These are not troll make. They are old swords, very old swords of the High Elves of the West, my kin. They were made in Gondolin for the Goblin Wars. They must have come from a dragon's hoard or goblin plunder, for dragons and goblins destroyed that city many ages ago. This, Thorin, the rune's name Orcrist, the goblin cleaver in the ancient tongue of Gondolin. It was a famous blade. This, Gandalf, was Glamdring, foe hammer that the king of Gondolin once wore. Keep them well. So, the sword of the king of Gondolin and another famous sword of that age. We get a little bit more information later when the goblins encounter those two swords under the Misty Mountains. The great goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage when he looked at Orcrist, and all his soldiers gnashed their teeth, clashed their shields, and stamped. They knew the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time, when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills or did battle before their walls. They had called it Orcrist, goblin cleaver, but the goblins simply called it biter. They hated it, and hated worse anyone that carried it. Glamdring, that the goblins called beater, got a similar reaction. So we have some sort of a history for Glamdring and Orcrist. They were forged in the First Age by the elves of Gondolin, the hidden city. They were forged with magic, and runes were placed upon them, specifically to help them against goblins or orcs who threatened the city. They would glow blue when goblins or orcs were close by, and they seemed particularly effective against everything orcish. Glamdring evidently belonged to Turgon, the king of Gondolin. His name may be unfamiliar to many Lord of the Rings fans, but he was quite an important figure in the First Age of Middle-earth. We do not know who wielded Orcrist, but it was presumably somebody important from Gondolin. Someone who fought a lot of orcs and goblins. Thanks to Tolkien's extensive histories of that time, we know the names of quite a few of those people and what weapons they had. And although there is a lot of very nerdy detail I could go into here, I think the most likely candidate for originally owning Orcrist is Ecthelion, Lord of the People of the Fountain. We're told in the history of Middle-earth that, on account of the amount of goblins he killed, his name is a terror among the goblins to this day, which fits with the great goblin's reaction to his sword. Gondolin fell, though, and Turgon and Ecthelion were killed in the fall of Gondolin. Their swords were no doubt looted in the aftermath. After that, Elrond's best guess has to be our best guess, that they were passed down and plundered from other plunderers until they ended up with the trolls, who had no idea of their ancient legacy. Which accounts for Glamdring and Orcrist, but we're concerned about Sting. Sting, let's remember, was forged with the same magical technology. It glows blue when orcs or goblins are nearby, for example, but is a lot less glamorous, just a dagger to an elf, and without the showy jewelled hilt or runes. But still from Gondolin in the First Age, and presumably made on the orders of Turgon, the king. Which leaves open an intriguing possibility. Turgon's other great lieutenant in Gondolin, as well as Ecthelion, was Glorfindel. And Glorfindel, we know, fought with a sword and a dagger, or a dirk, as Tolkien called it. He actually used it when fighting the Balrog in that epic First Age battle. Thorondor, the Great Eagle, carried his body to safety afterwards, where it was buried by the elves, but his dagger was presumably left stuck in the Balrog's body, and, like Glamdring and Orcrist, plundered after the fall of the city. So, perhaps, just perhaps, Bilbo's sword sting was Glorfindel's dagger that he used to help kill the Balrog. One objection to this theory is that Glorfindel was there at Rivendell when Elrond read the runes on Glamdring and Orcrist. Surely he would have recognised his own dagger, but as far as we can tell, Bilbo never even shows Sting to Elrond. Indeed, we are told that he wore it inside his breeches, hidden inside his trouser leg, in other words. It hadn't seemed like an important weapon when he picked it up, and it didn't seem important enough to trouble Elrond with. So perhaps Sting had a storied history even before Bilbo and then Frodo inherited it. I certainly like to think so. But even if that isn't true, it was definitely forged by the elven smiths in Gondolin, and with the same kind of magic and powers as the other two blades wielded by Turgon and Ecthelion. And what are those powers? Well, there seem to be three obvious ones. The first is the blade's longevity. By the time of The Hobbit, it has been around for perhaps 7 millennia, and it seems as sharp and potent and without rust or other damage as the day it was forged. This is actually quite a feature. How many perfectly preserved weapons do we have from 5000 BC? The second power is how it glows blue when in the presence of orcs or goblins. The two swords we mentioned earlier had this same power. This ensures the owner is never surprised or ambushed by them. It's both quite powerful and clearly indicative of the kinds of battles the bearer was expected to be in. If you want to be extra geeky about that, I did a deep dive into exactly what range that orc radar had based on the clues Tolkien leaves us. I'll leave a link here, but it's worth noting for now that this wasn't just an on-off feature. Sting's owner can even get an idea of how far away orcs or goblins are based on how bright the sword is. Useful. Thirdly, Sting is noticeably super effective against giant spiders and other evil beings. Indeed, Bilbo names it Sting, it didn't have a name before, because it was so effective against the silk and webs of the giant spiders of Mirkwood. We see this multiple times. In Moria, Boromir's sword just glances off the cave troll's hide, but Sting cuts through easily. Aragorn even pauses to praise the weapon mid-combat. In Shelob's lair, Sam hacks at Shelob's spiderweb with his ordinary sword and can't even cut a thread, but when Frodo uses Sting, it cuts through them like a scythe through grass. And of course, ultimately, it is Sting that does for Shelob. Her skin was so thick that it could not be penetrated by human, dwarf or elf, we are told, but Sting cuts through. I suppose that this brings a sort of echo to Sting's usage in the Third Age. The spiders of Mirkwood that Bilbo first used Sting against, and why he named the sword Sting, were the descendants of Shelob, and it is against Shelob that it finds its most pivotal moment, saving Sam's life, and with that the Ring Quest, and ultimately the fate of Middle-earth. If the hobbits hadn't had Sting then... And there is an even deeper echo there. We read that as Sam wielded it against Shagrat in Cirith Ungol, in his hand was Sting, and its light smote the eyes of the orc like the glitter of cruel stars in the terrible elf countries, the dream of which was a cold fear to all his kind. In Sam's hand, undoubtedly the least competent fighter in the whole fellowship, at the end, it played the role of its two greater cousins Glamdring and Orcrist in bringing fear to orcs who threatened the free peoples of Middle-earth. So, how powerful is Sting? I suppose that it is really a sort of analogue for Tolkien's world, because when it was forged, probably no one thought it was particularly powerful, certainly compared to Glamdring and Orcrist, who were apparently forged at the same time with the same magical technology. Sting was a dagger to the elves, and unremarkable in its simple leather sheath to those who held it after. But Sting if I am right, despite its humble beginnings, was probably even more important to the history of Middle-earth than either Glamdring or Orcrist. Perhaps it was Sting that Glorfindel used in killing the Balrog. That self-sacrificial death enabled the child Eärendil to escape Gondolin. Eärendil the mariner, who would a few years later sail to Valinor on a mission which literally saved Middle-earth from the forces of evil. Bilbo discovering it and using it to save the dwarves in Mirkwood led directly to the death of Smaug and their reclamation of Erebor, and without it in Mordor, Sam and Frodo simply wouldn't have survived to take the One Ring to Mount Doom. But despite all this, Sting was, in true Tolkien style, overlooked by almost everyone. Gandalf didn't stop to consider it in The Hobbit. Elrond didn't appraise it in Rivendell. Bilbo seems to have literally hidden it down his trouser leg for most of his adventures. How powerful was Sting? Probably less powerful than its sisters Glamdring and Orcrist, but in terms of its impact, it was without doubt one of the most important blades in Middle-earth history. If you'd like more videos on The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's wider legendarium, please click on the link on the left of your screen. Or if you'd like to support this channel, thank you. There's a link now on the right of your screen. That's all for this time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon.